Once you open the demo file, you will see a bunch of minerals arranged on the table, and that's how it should look. But first, let's jump over to Preferences and make sure that within the system settings, we have our GPU visible. We can tell that my render device, which is NVIDIA, the GPU, got recognized. There are different options available for accelerating ray tracing, such as CUDA and optics, with optics being available on NVIDIA GPUs only and being the fastest option that I know. Then if you own one of the AMD graphics cards, you'll be able to choose the HIP instead. But I'll stick to optics though currently. Okay, throughout the tutorial, we're gonna use Cycles render engine to keep things slightly more streamlined and realistic right out of the box. So within the render engine drop-down menu, I'm selecting Cycles and making sure that the device is set to GPU compute. GPUs render much faster in Cycles than CPUs generally. What I usually like to do when dealing with lighting is create two windows, one for the final render view, which will use the rendered mode of the viewport, and the second one at the top for the material preview. Here we got our camera through which we will see our final shot, our render. Now the render icons are located at the top of the user interface of the viewport. There we can change it from the default shading mode to the material preview one and to the rendered mode, which is right over there. It will enable the Cycles path tracing rendering mode in this particular window, and we will use it throughout the tutorial, so let's keep it turned on. Depending on the video card, it can be rather slow or pretty fast, but let's keep it in the rendered mode for now. And the top one will be our material preview mode. To make sense of our scene, it will use some random HDRI included by default with Blender. But no matter the HDRI environment chosen though, the point of this viewport is to be our secondary monitor with the lights and the UI elements on all the time. That is our working environment decoupled from the Cycles rendered view, if that makes sense. If you don't want to use a generic HDRI there, you can switch on the scene world and scene lights, which will make it look fairly similar to the rendered mode, but I will disable all these options. I need this HDRI to just have enough information to see things clearly, because you know our bottom view will be constrained to what the camera sees, and it will be fairly slow and stuff like that. Okay, going over to the environment settings, we can tell that the only light source our scene has is this abstract gray environment. We can play with the exposure of this default Blender environment, but actually what I'll do is reduce it all the way down to 0 to start from scratch. Our cinematic method implies that we start from scratch anyway. Okay, so Blender cursor can serve as the spawning point for any kind of objects. So when I press Shift A and add the area light, it gets spawned just on top of 3 cursor. We can click and drag to make it larger or smaller. If we press T to open the left tool shelf and select the transform gizmo, you can actually use the handles of this gizmo to move, rotate, scale up and down our light source. But usually I like to do it in a slightly different way, utilizing Blender hotkeys. So G is to move the objects around. The movement can be constrained to X, Y, and Z axes by utilizing the X, Y, and Z keys. The same with rotations. R to rotate, X, Y, and Z afterwards to constrain it to a certain axis. And finally, the S shortcut scales the object. Not a whole lot of things to remember. G to move or grab, R to rotate, S to scale. It's good to remember these 3. These shortcuts quickly become second nature for moving objects, in this case light sources, around. And when it comes to adjusting the light source settings, as a quick refresher, we have this green light bulb icon within the Blender user interface, and there we can access all the settings like the color, the power, the shape of the light source, the size, whatever else. Everything can be adjusted from there. Changing the size from that menu is practically the same as scaling the object. So it's interchangeable in this sense. And whatever you're gonna do, don't you dare unticking the Cast Shadows button in Cycles. Shadows are important. Okay, throughout the videos you will see me accessing the objects in either of these windows, sometimes in the rendered view, sometimes in the material preview. You will also notice me toggling off the visibility of the UI elements with this button in the rendered view. Sometimes the user interface can get in the way, especially when there's a lot going on in the viewport. So shutting the noisy UI elements up really helps to focus on what matters. What else do we have here? As for the camera, we have one here in the Camera 01 Outliner collection. We can press 0 on the numpad to jump into the camera view, or Ctrl 0 to make any camera the active one. A nice little hack in Cycles to juice slightly more performance out of it is to press Ctrl B and draw the rectangle around the viewport, or rather around the camera view, or actually around a portion of the camera view even. That would constrain the render region around that particular portion of the viewport, and within the view output properties you can see the render region checkbox that can be turned on and off. And basically that is it. Again, we can switch between the render modes using these icons, or we can press Z to bring up this pie menu, whatever feels more comfortable to you, I guess. So I think that should be it for the basic Blender setup and for the settings that may come in handy throughout the tutorial. Once again, the render engine has been set to Cycles, the device to GPU compute, to avoid any confusion. As for the light paths, there is no real need to adjust it. Well, maybe I'll limit the diffuse, glossy and transmission bounces a little bit to speed up the viewport. And this is it. I also have a personal superstition about increasing the indirect light clamping just in case, to not lose the precious rays generated by Cycles. More about that later. I will show some comparisons and stuff like that. Now I'll just say that this is it for the boring part. The Cycles is set up, the shortcuts are mentioned. Nothing stops us from diving deep into setting up lighting, so that is what we will do in a moment. And by the way, if you have any questions about setting up the blend file or accessing the project files, feel free to reach out to us or to other students of this particular course in our Discord. And now onto the exciting part, setting up the key lights or the main light.